Ladies and gentlemen, disasters are a harsh reality for millions of people across the world, disrupting lives and livelihoods and reversing development progress for entire nations. Just recently, I was seeing on one of the international news services a massive landslide in Papua New Guinea, where over 2,000 persons were killed in one go. We have had disasters that would have taken far more lives than that, but it just goes to show that one day everything could be fine, and then something totally unexpected occurs, and it has national impact, even global impact. Here in Jamaica, we are acutely aware of this reality as a small island developing state. It is something that we live with on a daily basis, but we have somehow managed to live with it to the point where we have just put it in the back of our consciousness. But I'm certain that every day, every Jamaican is whispering a prayer to say, thank you, Lord, for sparing this country from the worst that could have happened. I recall sitting in the cabinet room when the first tremors of that, 5.6 earthquake took place. And when I looked to my right for Minister Mackenzie, he was nowhere to be found. Of course, when I found myself under the table, Minister Mackenzie was out the door. And you would be very proud of us. We followed the protocol. Yes, we ducked, we went under the desk, we put ourselves in the roll position, and then as soon as we felt it was safe, we all ran in single file down the stairs and outside to safety. And we did not go back into the building until we were advised that it was safe. So we were a good example, Minister Mackenzie. We were a good example. And of course, we all did our collective and private prayers of thanking God for sparing Jamaica the worst. The response from our security forces and from our emergency entities, I would not say it was sufficient, but we were able to respond quickly, to give the country some amount of information in the immediate aftermath, and to take some actions to ensure that the nation was properly informed, and to, in the event of any other occurrences, that we would have been prepared. But it did show up some weaknesses in our ability to respond. And I believe that Minister Mackenzie would have assessed the situation to ensure that should this happen again, that we are in a far better position to have a complete and more effective response. And I put it in that way because the truth is you will never be 100% prepared to respond to a disaster. But every disaster that occurs, you must take the opportunity to review it, to see where you had shortfalls and shortcomings, where the gaps existed, and we must then figure out how we can close those gaps, overcome those shortcomings, so that if the next disaster occurs, we are in a much better position to respond. So a part of my presentation to this body here today is to say that we must learn from the disasters that have occurred and prepare for the ones to come. So I'm speaking now to all the managers, all the leaders, all the persons with responsibility who can ensure that we are prepared. I caught the last part of your presentation, and you said the tabletop exercises are good, but they're not sufficient. So we can always do tabletop exercises, planning for earthquakes and other disasters. Well, we had a live test. What came out of that live test? What were the gaps? What were the shortcomings? What were the resources that did not perform? Who did not perform? Why did they not perform? So that assessment, I'm certain, was done. I'm certain that the gap analysis was conducted, and we need to act on it to make sure that we are prepared for the next occurrence of a disaster. It is not if, it is when. So the past decade has revealed a worrying trend, an increase in the frequency and intensity of natural disasters, particularly severe weather events like hurricanes. The escalation is no doubt fueled by climate change. Of course, everything these days is put at the feet of climate change. There is a sense that climate change is a naturally occurring phenomenon. But really, it is a man-made phenomenon. It is our consumption patterns, our consumption decisions, our economic decisions, our development decisions that drive the change in the climate. So in effect, it is the activity of mankind that is driving these changes. And in a sense, it is also the activity of mankind that can mitigate these changes. So disaster preparedness is about mankind managing what we do in order to be prepared to develop the ability not just to respond, but to withstand the impact of these changes. It becomes even more complex for us because not only are these disasters being driven by natural phenomenon and man-made phenomenon in terms of weather, but they're also being driven by biological phenomena like pandemics, which add another layer of complexity to disasters. And then not to mention other forms of disasters which are happening. For example, wars which creates migration, or unstable states which create waves of migration which can spur other kinds of disaster responses. So we are living, as we have always done as a society, but now increasing with intensity and complexity, in a time where we could have multiple disasters happening all at once. So you could have a pandemic, a hurricane. You could also have a humanitarian disaster, all three that you have to be able to respond to at the same time. So we have to be prepared. We have to be ready. Thankfully, we have a law that mandates that we must be prepared, that mandates us to be in a position of readiness. And that law mandates that all the stakeholders, all the leaders of our disaster response and readiness, that at a particular time in the calendar, we must all meet, and I must give you a charge. I must drive the fear of God into you. But I must also encourage you to take the readiness of the nation seriously. So, in this context, the National Disaster Risk Management Council plays a critical role in safeguarding our nation. Our mission is to build robust systems to counter the escalating threat of disasters impacting our people, infrastructure, and our economy. As frequency and complexity of disasters evolve, so must we. The Council must be more agile and strategic. Regular meetings are crucial. They allow us to scrutinize our disaster management strategies, celebrate successes, identify weaknesses, and develop innovative solutions for all phases, whether it is preparedness, mitigation, response, or recovery. By working together and adapting, we can ensure the Council remains a powerful force in protecting our people and our communities. We are not standing still, waiting to react to disasters when they happen. We are rising to the challenge and proactively building a strong and resilient nation capable of withstanding any adversity. Now, Jamaica's real challenge over the past 50 years has not been that we have had low growth on average. Yes, we have had low growth. But rather, the real challenge has been the significant economic volatility surrounding that average low growth. So it's one thing if you're growing at 1 or 2% every year on average. But it is another thing if every 5 years you have a disaster which drops your growth well below the average, and then you have to recover. And in fact, the history of Jamaica has been that when we have had a disaster, so we might be growing like this, disaster, and then it takes us a long time to recover, so we grow like this. We eventually recover, only to end up in another disaster. And that has been our challenge. How do we, even if it is that our economy is giving low growth numbers, how do we recover quickly from disaster? Now, I haven't done the research, and though I have looked at data anecdotally, but I wouldn't. What I'm about to say shouldn't be taken as scientific. But I have noted that almost biannually we are having a major flood event or rain event that causes flooding island-wide. So if you look at my presentations to Parliament, which is what I use to market, almost every 2 years I have to go to Parliament to explain what the government is going to do in emergency response for roads that have been scoured, or landslides that need retaining wall, or roads that have to be cleared. And I have been doing that since 2016. So almost every 2 years, the NWA has a budget that it did not prepare for. In other words, it had expenses for unplanned mitigation events. So, and it's usually as a result of a tropical storm so far that has created heavy rain. So last year, we had heavy rains that impacted St. Thomas, most of the parishes of St. Thomas, parts of Kingston, parts of Clarendon. That's not budgeted for, but we had to find the resources to pay for it. But what has been the difference in the last 10 years with Jamaica's ability to quickly recover from a disaster? If you notice that Jamaica's recovery from the pandemic has been rapid. In other words, so we've been growing like this, 2.5%. Pandemic hits, our economic growth bottoms out. We lost 150,000 jobs. But within a year, we are back up and we're back on our growth trajectory, 2 to 3%. One of the reasons why we have been able to do that is because of the fiscal program. But the fiscal program and when we say the good management of the economy, an element of that, significant element of that, is that we have managed to put in place buffers in our economy. And that it's very important that the nation understands this, because sometimes the conversation about good economic management seems to be a kind of mystery. What is this good economic management, and what is the value of good economic management? What is the utility that good economic management brings to the country? So it's not just keeping the dollar stable. It's not just managing inflation. It's not just bringing down the debt to GDP. All of those lovely things that you hear about when we talk about economic management. It's not just ensuring that we have good credit rating, but most importantly, it is about ensuring that when a disaster strikes, we have the wherewithal to respond and to overcome. We never had that capability 10 years ago. Because if a disaster struck, what would have been our response? If a disaster struck, we would have to borrow. Or just leave it. That's a major difference in Jamaica. So in other words, Jamaica in this decade is far superior to Jamaica in the last 3, 4, 5 decades. It's a massive change in who we are as a people, our institutions, as a country. And that's fundamental to Jamaica's long-term progress and sustainability. And I have to use this opportunity to make the point, because there is a sense that is in our people that good economic management has no value for our daily life. We tend to take it for granted that somehow increasing wages for public sector workers just materializes like that. Announcing a $160 million US program to repair pipelines in Trelawney and St. James. It just materializes like that. we just dismiss the value of good economic performance. And when you read the scripts that are prepared for events like these, this is what it sounds like. So by addressing the underlying causes of our economic fluctuations and strengthening our ability to withstand shocks, we have created a more stable and predictable economic environment for sustainable growth. And we just take that for granted. Oh, that just sounds very nice. All of you go back home and say, oh, it just sounds very nice. But don't make the connection of the importance that should that good economic management goes away, should it go away, God forbid, disaster risk financing and risk transfer are at the core of our strategic framework. Now, I heard you say Jamaica is doing very well at risk transfer. What does that mean? And how are we able to do this risk transfer? Well, think of it as an insurance policy for our nation. By setting aside funds and spreading the risk, we can recover more swiftly after a disaster strikes. When have we been able to set aside funds and buy insurance in our economic history so that we can respond swiftly if a disaster strikes? When COVID struck, we were able to respond. We had buffers. When disaster struck in previous times, we weren't able to respond in any significant way. We had a $40 billion response care package that kept people paid during a time when they were laid off. We were able to give subsidies to Jamaicans to keep their households going. That is the utility of good economic management. So in other words, good economic management is the fundamentally important element of a disaster response and recovery strategy. And if you don't have that as the basis, your ability to respond will be limited. So, this government has taken the necessary steps to enhance our fiscal resilience to natural disasters and shocks, and we are actively building capacity to effectively respond to new and emerging hazards. In this ever-changing risk landscape, disaster risk financing and transfer play a critical role in effective disaster risk management and risk reduction. These instruments help countries and communities recover faster. According to data from Munich Re, the world's largest insurer, extreme storms and other natural disasters caused about US $250 billion in losses last year, with less than half of that covered by insurers. The best way for governments to spread the risks related to natural disasters and ensure rapid recovery is to support the development of risk transfer and risk financing instruments that meet the needs of their country and people. Your government has embarked on a layered approach to disaster risk management and risk transfer. This approach is supported by the National Natural Disaster Risk Financing Policy, which promotes a risk-layered approach to funding disaster relief, recovery, and reconstruction. This includes establishing adequate reserves to address the cost associated with high-frequency, low-severity events such as floods or heavy rains and transferring the risks related to low frequency, high severity events such as major hurricanes and earthquakes through a portfolio of financing instruments. This strategy includes establishing adequate funds, facilities, and reserves to ensure protection against both low and high intensity events. So this is what the script sounds like. If I were to do a pop quiz around the room and ask, what did I just say? What did I just say? I'm sure, I wouldn't get the correct response from everyone. And this is a challenge, right? We're in an era where there's just so much information, but it's not necessarily context and knowledge. And so we have to take the time to make the connections, break the information down, and reason with people. I'm certain the media may carry some of what I have read here, and it will probably be 2 or a minute, if that, maybe 30 seconds, if that much. And the average man will just hear this and say, oh, it sounds nice, or I don't understand what he's saying. And it floats over. And these really important, these fundamental things don't get into the public discourse as to what is important for Jamaica. Now, my job as Prime Minister is to take some of these complex information, break them down into relatable, bite-sized packets of information that everyone can consume, and then internalize it so that it becomes a part of what we call the political economy. Meaning that, the Jamaican voter is consuming information that is not necessarily the best information to help them to make the right decisions about the future of their country. So it's one thing to live in an area that is at risk of a disaster. So you live on a hillside, you live in a gully course, you live close to the sea, and you hear this talk about climate change, you hear this talk about low intensity, high frequency weather event. What is that? How do I make a decision to protect myself against a low intensity, high frequency weather event? What's my role in all of that? What should I hold my government to account in ensuring that as a citizen I am not at risk of a low intensity, high frequency event? How empowered am I as an elector, as a voter, as a citizen to be able to live in this world of multiple and complex disasters happening simultaneously? Part of the responsibility of this group is to ensure that each Jamaican is informed and understand their role as a citizen in this era of climate change, this era of multiple and complex disasters that could happen simultaneously. That is also a part of the preparedness when every man understands. So at the government level, we're doing what is necessary, but we need to do more to bring in the Jamaican person, the average Jamaican, into the understanding of what it means to be a citizen in this era. So the government of Jamaica maintains a national disaster fund which exceeds now $550 million. And I remember distinctly, Minister Mackenzie, you'll recall when we when we started to look at that National Disaster Fund, which was $100 million at the time. It was not funded. And we put the money in to fund it. And I believe you have it there at local government. Yes, so what we did, we started to put aside funds as buffers that in the event that a low intensity, high frequency event happens, we don't have to borrow to deal with it. So if there is a tropical storm, for example, which seems to be hitting us on a 2-year cycle, and we didn't put anything in the budget at NWA or any other entity, but it happens, immediately we send out the tractors, mobilize the contractors, the backhoes and everything, and they go out and they do what they have to do to reopen roads and reestablish connections. That's what you call a low intensity, high frequency weather event. So Jamaica has built resilience to be able to respond to these kind of low intensity but high frequency events. That was not necessarily the position that we were in previous decades. And we are not, I'm not hereby saying that we are in a perfect position, but every year we get stronger, both in terms of the resources that we are able to put into our fund to self-insure, because that is what it is in terms of building the buffers. But should a high intensity, low frequency event happens now, which would be like a major hurricane. You know, how many of you were around for Hurricane Gilbert? Everybody here? Most. So that is what you would call, you know, a high intensity, but doesn't happen often. And you can recall that for Hurricane Gilbert, how long it took us to recover. We can't be in that position. We must be able to recover, you know, within the year that the event occurred. In fact, months after the event occurred. That must be our target, and I'm saying this to all of you who are here, that you have to, your agencies that are responsible for recovery, that has to be your plan. Now, in terms of how we finance that plan for recovery, it may have to be that we have to go and do some borrowing. But before you reach to that, let us put aside some money for insurance. And that is what we've been doing. So, additionally, we have an Inter-American Development Bank contingent credit facility providing access to $285 million if we are affected by a hurricane or earthquake of a specific severity. And Jamaica is also a member of the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility, the CRIF, a multi-risk pooling mechanism. To guide this process, the focus has broadened to include multiple hazard assessments and comprehensive data collection. The scope of data required for informed decision-making has increased, and analysis of vulnerability and risk must account for the complex nature of disaster. Therefore, ministries, departments, and agencies of the National Disaster Risk Management Council must ensure access to evidence-based research and information across critical sectors. So, in order to get insurance, you have to have data. You have to have the data to secure the insurance, and you have to have data to trigger the insurance. So a part of your job in being prepared for our response is to make sure that we're collecting the data. And I'm sure the entities who are here have been doing an excellent job. That's one thing I can be certain of, that we are collecting data. I see it in whether it is from the NEPA point of view, or from the earthquake unit, or from the fire, from the ODPEM. We have data, but we must continue to refine. From the Met Office, we must continue to collect and refine and analyze that data. So I want to conclude this part of my presentation then by saying that the utility of good economic management is that it gives us a good base on which we are able to respond and recover from disaster. And that is the essence of resilience. So good economic management gives us resilience. It is important that the average citizen understands that they have a role to play in our disaster preparedness. And the critical role is to hold the government to account for what is the government doing to creating buffers to be able to sufficiently respond to low intensity, high frequency events. Is that a part of the political economy of voters? Does that really matter to voters? Maybe not. But in a well-developed democracy, if people are voting on this, then it means that governments definitely have to craft their policies and programs to that. So it's important to have the ecosystem where the average citizen is holding their government to account for matters of how we are responding to climate change. What are the policies? Because remember what we have said, that climate change is yes, it's a natural phenomenon, but in many ways it's a man-made phenomenon. So what are our governments doing to control the man-made impact on climate change and both the adaptation and mitigation to climate change? Is that yet a part of our political economy? Are voters holding our governments to account for this? And the answer is, it is developing, it is seeping into the consciousness. But luckily, the government has taken an advanced position, even if it's not a matter that is of concern to the electorate. Governments understand. And this government in particular has taken a very proactive stance on the climate change issues, our mitigation and our adaptation and our general resilience and response. And you can see that in many ways, our stance on plastics and the ban that we put on single-use plastics. And even though it's a phased approach, but we have taken those steps. Good point now to mention that the public sees the problem from the point of view of unsightly waste and the uncleanliness of our city and so forth. But whilst I see the problem in that light as well, I also see the problem of how it is impacting on the infrastructure, how it is damaging our sea environment, and of course, the heavy use of plastics and the production of plastics and the carbon that releases and the impact that has on climate change. So for us, we take a very holistic view, and we have been putting in place policies as small steps as we can, but relative to our resources, big steps nonetheless, to address these issues in a very positive way. So we're going at the problem from both the cause and the effect. And we are also trying to educate our citizens so that they can be active, enabled participant in this whole treating with this new world that we're living in, where the impact of climate change is something that governments have to mainstream in their daily management of economic and social affairs. Now, in terms of the hurricane season, because we're having this meeting just before the hurricane season, and the projections for this season suggests that it will be an above average season. Minister Mackenzie, my recollection is that this was also the projection last year. My recollection that last year we would have a above average season. They're expecting, that is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration of the United States, they're projecting that there should be 17 to 25 named storms, 8 to 13 hurricanes, and 4 to 7 major hurricanes of category 3 or higher. Notably, this forecast for named storms, hurricanes, and major hurricanes is the highest that NOAA has issued for the May outlook. The start of the hurricane season is therefore an appropriate time to assess the exposure of homes, infrastructure, services, productive activities, and our workplaces, although it is more ideal to have started this way in advance. So I take this opportunity to encourage all Jamaicans as we enter the hurricane season to, first of all, do your household preparations. Put aside food stock and water as much as you can. Make provisions for the protection of your important documents or valuables. If it's only a Ziploc bag that you can afford, or if you can afford one of those hardy plastic or rubber containers, or if you can make provision for safety somewhere. Look at your home and see what is likely to be destroyed in a hurricane. Roof, windows, doors, trees that are in proximity to your home. Start making preparations to cut some of those branches that might become a projectile. In this era where you could have a significant weather event, whether it is a low intensity or a high intensity event, the impact is not only going to be on you, it is going to be community-wide. So speak with your neighbor, your family member who may be alone and not in a position to help themselves. Start thinking about the contingencies. And I've gone through a few of these hurricanes, not from the point of view of trying to prepare for my own safety, but as member of parliament or as minister, having to go around and tour. And shelters are an important part of the response. So the entities that are here that are managing and supervising these centers, those should be up and running and ready in the event of a disaster. The conditions in some of those centers are not always ideal. So I think that in the event that your community is affected and you have to go to one of those centers, you should be prepared with your own personal items as well. The Minister of Education is here. Schools are oftentimes the emergency shelters. So I hope that the principals are aware and we don't have a situation where we can't find a watchman, place is locked up. And as I have had situations like that being brought to my attention. So we all have to be, because simple things like that, it's part of the preparedness. So I don't need to go into all the details of how we prepare for a hurricane. I'm sure everybody knows, but I've given you the basics. Oh, and I should say your batteries for your flashlights. Very, very important. So as we conclude, Jamaica must live with our reality of being one of the most exposed countries in the world to multiple hazards, including hurricanes, floods, droughts, earthquakes, storms, surges, and landslides. Models have predicted the increased impact of catastrophic natural events arising from heightened surface temperatures and global sea level rise. Adverse events impact livelihoods, destroy infrastructure, and disrupt the provision of services. Through land use planning, urban renewal, and building codes regulation, we are creating safer and more resilient spaces. We are safeguarding our development gains from being washed away in any disaster. Now, as I read this point, and I was driving into Kingston, Minister Mackenzie, driving from Kingston to here, I was observing that there is an increase, a real increase in the number of buildings that are multiple stories. And when I say multiple stories, greater than 3. And that in itself means that we have to have a different strategy for disaster response. It's one thing to respond to, a 3-story fire, or a collapse of a building that's 3-story high. But when you start to go to 4 and 7 and 9 stories and 20 stories, there's a whole different capability that is required. So I'm going to take this opportunity, now that I have everybody here. The minister has pointed out that it's something that we have discussed, to be fair. We have discussed this at our cabinet as to what we're going to do to be prepared. And we have ordered 3 trucks that have the extended. 3, Minister? 5. We have 5 trucks that will have the extended capabilities. But of course, there may be other things that we need to execute a rescue or to be able to respond to such a disaster. So, for example, we have to be able to manage traffic to get to an area. So all of those rules will have to be looked at. So it's a whole ecosystem of disaster response support that when we go into this new level of building, that has to be triggered. And so I know the fire department, the Ministry of Local Government, and all the other disaster response entities, and NEPA in terms of the approvals, they have been discussing this, but I'm taking the opportunity to point out that this has to be a special area, a special focus of our disaster response. So as we enter the hurricane season, which we use as our trigger to mobilize our national disaster response, I'm confident that Jamaica has the leadership right here in this room to ensure that should a disaster strike, we have the ability financially to recover. We have the ability to organize to recover. And we have the will and the motivation to even make the personal sacrifice of our time and effort to put the financial resources with the organizational resources, with the leadership resources to ensure that Jamaica recovers stronger and better than we were before the disaster. God bless you and thank you.